Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is, Ich bin ein Berliner. There are many people in the world who really don't understand what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin.
Kennedy's statement can't really be compared to anything else. He actually came to Berlin with a totally different speech in mind, just so you know. But he decided to see the wall, and they drove him along the Berlin Wall. It was 1963. Kennedy went up several watchtowers. They took photos of him, and East German border guards studied him. It really made a strong impression. He went back to his hotel and completely rewrote his speech.
It's studied as the best.
Exactly.
One of the funnest speeches
Exactly.
ever.
To those who believe that communism is the bright system of the future, let them come to Berlin. To anyone who thinks it's possible to sign agreements with communists, to live peacefully with them, let them come to Berlin. To those who keep saying it's possible and so on, let them come to Berlin. He repeats this phrase one last time in German, lasst ihn nach Berlin kommen. And then, suddenly, he ends his speech with an entirely unexpected twist. He said, today, every person on earth who values freedom, who respects individual dignity, and so on, every person today must say that they too are a Berliner. And I, as someone who respects these principles, say to you today,
all free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the word, Ich bin ein Berliner.
On November 9th, 1989, we were sitting at headquarters watching TV, and Politburo member Günter Schabowski announced they were ready to open the border. Suddenly, huge crowds started gathering at the wall in the city center, especially near the Bornholmer Bridge, where the atmosphere was electric. We were stunned and didn't know what to do or how to respond. We just stayed at our post waiting for orders, but no orders came that night. I had never seen so many people gathered in one place in my entire life. Tons of journalists, countless TV cameras. It felt like the whole world was watching. I called the GDR Prime Minister, Mr. Modrau, and asked if I should open the Brandenburg Gate. He responded, yes, we should, otherwise they'll throw stones at us. Right then, I felt a light tapping on my shoulder. It was an older lady standing there with tears in her eyes. She said, you're happy too, aren't you? What could I say in that moment? I forced a smile, trying to match her emotion, and told her, I'm happy too.
You know, I had this question in Leipzig when we were there celebrating the day of the liberation movement. Everyone was walking with candles, a huge crowd, the whole city illuminated by soft light. For them, it's a major holiday. And I stood there realizing that we don't celebrate the August Putsch. Nobody takes to the streets for the democracy we supposedly achieved. Why do you think it is?
It's simple, because we never truly got democracy. We didn't win. What are we celebrating? Just an attempt? We basically never lived a single day under real democracy, right? Ordinary, people's hopes didn't pan out. I understand why some want to return to the Soviet Union, because those hopes that we had back then didn't come true. And in the end, the same KGB we overthrew took power. That's all there is to it. What's there to celebrate?
According to the Unified National Front lists of the German Democratic Republic, yes votes were 98.85%. The turnout was 98.77%.
We were shocked. No, we didn't expect anything from that election. The result was, as always, predetermined. But for them to forge the results so blatantly, so shamelessly, they must have stolen about 15% of the votes. Those counterfeit ballots, which symbolize that era, are now on display in our city museum. And by then, we were already going out every Monday to protest. It was absurd. On TV, we saw one country, carefully curated, but on the streets, we saw a completely different one.
It's amazing that the GDR revolution began in a place where people usually come to humble themselves and repent, St. Nicholas Church. In the 80s, Pastor Christian Führer was here, leading prayers on Mondays for peace, and he became like a superstar and an icon of hope. Each time, more and more people gathered in unity. Then one day, after a service of about 1,200 people, they simply refused to go home and went to the streets.
Und dann weiter. Gar nicht so wichtig nehmen, diesen Akzent. Dann gibt es immer noch ein bisschen die Situation, wenn du in das Coupé reingehst, dass du da... When we started fighting for our freedom, I was already dancing in this theater. Ein bisschen tiefer. I was 24. And I had a ton of invitations to perform our productions in the West, but I couldn't go because I didn't have a passport, nor any way to obtain one. It really got me down and made me question everything. I always believed that if you work on stage, you can't just ignore politics. The stage isn't just a place for art and entertainment. It has to reflect what's going on in the country. People come here looking for answers to life's deeper questions. And for folks in East Germany back then, theater became a rare sanctuary, a special place where they could find even a few answers. We staged plays by Heiner Müller, Tolstoy, or other writers whose works perfectly mirrored the tensions and struggles of the times. It was bold and, honestly, quite risky. But we were fortunate. The approval board was clueless. They didn't understand any of the hints or the subtext in our productions. I even managed to slip Faust through the censors, packed with not-so-subtle jabs at the government. I had dancers in uniform hopping around the stage, openly mocking the GDR police.
Protests in Leipzig were cracked down on pretty harshly, as usual. Through a loudspeaker, they'd yell, "Disperse, we're the people's police." And the crowd would shout back, "We are the people." That chant became the symbol of Leipzig's freedom movement. It turns out that years earlier, undocumented immigrants from Mexico had used a similar slogan during demonstrations in the US. "We are America." Later, people in other countries picked it up too.
Back then, posters talked about freedom, freedom to travel, freedom of elections, freedom of the press, and so on. Basically, we demanded the right to speak our minds. That was the most crucial thing.
I wrote on my sign that the GDR's politics were in the same sorry state as the roofs of Leipzig's houses. And I added that the reason was because we had such an incompetent roofer and his helpers. The joke, of course, was that Honecker, the leader of the GDR, was actually a roofer by trade. I was walking with my sign carrying it proudly, and I noticed some people standing there with a video camera. I thought it was the second German television station from the West, so I made sure to hold my sign up to the camera, shaking it so they'd get a good shot of it. It wasn't until much later that I found out those people were Stasi agents.
One time, I got arrested by the Stasi police during a demonstration, but I had rehearsal in 30 minutes. I actually managed to escape. They chased me, but the theater guard wouldn't let them in. "Show your pass," and that was that. I remember being too shaken up to do my solo dance. My knees were trembling. All I could think was, just 20 minutes ago, I might have ended up in prison. Of course, there was violence, there were arrests. The first demonstration was met with an attempt to break it up. But despite the threats and the batons, people stood their ground. They didn't leave. They kept asking the police, why exactly should we leave this place? Why should we go? We're just standing here talking to each other. Even when the police started beating people, they didn't fight back. They didn't respond to the violence with more violence. We didn't want a war, we wanted a conversation.
Stasi soldiers were incredibly rough. When they dispersed rallies, I went to the Monday protests every single week. As long as the crowd stayed tightly together, nothing would happen. But the moment we spread out, the police would pounce without hesitation. It was like a coordinated manhunt, and honestly, it looked absolutely terrible to anyone watching.
Religion never played a big role in my life, but I was deeply curious about what was happening in Leipzig. So one day, I decided to get in my car and drive there myself. The police were stopping cars on the way in, interrogating people about where they were headed and why. If there were 3 or more people in a car, they wouldn't let them through. They'd just turn them back immediately. So I lied. I said I wasn't going to Leipzig at all, and that's how I managed to get in.
The city was packed with military vehicles. Beyond the police presence, there were also volunteer squads made up of factory workers patrolling the downtown area. They just wandered around aimlessly, waiting for orders from the authorities.
It's honestly surprising, isn't it? In a country with the word democratic in its name, the German Democratic Republic, any attempt to attend an opposition rally or even to hold up a sign with slogans the government didn't like would immediately result in arrest and harsh consequences. Of course, for someone from Europe today, especially my peers who've grown up with freedom, this sounds awful and completely incomprehensible. But for me, someone from Russia, it's all too easy to imagine exactly how it was and to understand the fear people must have felt. Did you guys have some kind of official plan for the military on how to break them up or
no, we didn't.
What to do? Did they get to talk?
Yes. If the protest was approved, you can go. The police would just escort it. That's it. But if it steps outside of that, what's allowed? But if it steps outside of that, what is allowed? Then you had to take normal steps like anywhere else.
You mean if it turned into a big riot?
Yeah, a mass riot. A violence against each other, maybe looting stores. All that can happen. If they start digging up rocks and throwing them at the police, then of course they have to answer back.
When they started to build up the wall in Berlin, I was only 3, so I have no memory. I actually grew up with the fact that the family is divided. My father was communist. The Communist Party was forbidden in West Germany, and he moved into East Germany in My mother, she was not a communist, but my mother wanted to keep contact to her family in West Germany, and she went. When they moved to Dresden, she went to an official place, and she asked, but you need to give up your West German passport and to change it in an East German ID. But when they built the border in Berlin, then this solution was cancelled. So Cold War now starts. It's all too complicated, too dangerous. So my mother, from the moment, felt imprisoned in East Germany. First, I entered school, and at the school, of course, every day I heard this propaganda stuff. And the border is established to protect us from the glass enemy. And now I knew I have relatives, my grandparents live behind the Iron Curtain. Then suddenly my grandparents came to our place because they, from a certain point, they were allowed to see us.
You were born during the Soviet era, let's call it, in the GDR. So where do these wild thoughts come from? That this is some sort of wrong regime and that the FRG is better off? You grew up on the same propaganda, didn't you?
Let me try to explain. I was born in 1948 in a zone controlled by the Soviet Union.
Then I went to school, and as you know, that's where the foundation for life is laid. In school, we were constantly told that the ideology of socialism would inevitably triumph, and that we had a duty to ensure no child in the world ever died of hunger or need. To prove our commitment to this noble cause, they sent us to collect beetles in the potato fields, claiming it was vital to make sure no one starved. And if there were delays with food supplies or poor harvests, it was always the West's fault. On TV, they even aired reports claiming that Western planes were deliberately dropping beetles over the GDR's potato fields to destroy crops and sabotage socialism itself. As I grew older, I started to realize that all of it was complete and utter nonsense. When I was forced to write essays about my deep love for the party, I didn't believe a single word I wrote. It disgusted me, the way I had to fake admiration, flatter those in power, and kiss someone's ass.
You can have two brains. I mean, what you think on one side, this is your own thing. But what you say loudly, this is the other thing. And if you want to deal and to cope, then you better put out the one side of the brain. All this was an heritage of the Second World War. After the war, the four allies who succeeded against Nazi Germany and Soviet Union, they divided Germany in four pieces. The longer East Germany existed, the more people realized this absolutely controlled by the Soviets, free speech, everything. They realized the only way is to leave, and more people did it.
The thing is, Berlin ended up being the one city where, in a really small space, you could directly compare two systems, democracy and communism, and see for yourself which one worked better. Hardly anyone from abroad ever visited the Soviet Union, and Soviet citizens almost never went west, aside from some diplomats or elite officials. But in Berlin, you could literally see the pros and cons of each system right there.
People who moved to the West, even before the wall was built, there were actually an incredible number of them. For example, when I was studying physics at university, every third student from our university left for the West.
At that time, I had just started working at the hospital, and I immediately noticed how many positions were left unfilled. There just weren't enough doctors. The wall was built to stop educated people from fleeing East Germany, or the country would have emptied out fast.
In 1961, 1,000 people were leaving every single day. By the time the wall was built, that number had doubled, 2,000 people a day. Can you imagine that? From 1949 to 1961, East Germany lost a quarter of its population. East Germany was the perfect country for children and the elderly. Social benefits,
security, right?
Kindergartens, schools, hospitals, great pensions, and apartment distribution. But there were no career opportunities, right? It wasn't that hard for them to end up in West Germany. And there, they had jobs. They needed workers. They needed specialists. Salaries were high, and there were even 0% mortgages. You know, I think even today's viewers would find a 0% mortgage appealing. Where do you need to go for that? You don't fly there. You run to West Berlin, and from there catch a plane to West Germany.
After World War II ended, were these two countries, West Germany and East Germany, on equal footing at the start?
By the end of the war, basically, there was no real difference. Germany was in ruins from bombings and occupations, with living conditions roughly the same everywhere. When the country was split into sectors, there still wasn't much difference. In the Soviet sector, it was actually a bit better at first because they quickly organized food supplies and expanded medical services, so in some ways, and it was even preferable. The difference only started later. One major mistake made by the Soviet Union, specifically by Stalin, was taking industrial equipment out of Germany as reparations. I understand they needed to rebuild the Soviet economy, but they were literally dismantling factories and shipping out entire machines. They practically turned that territory, it wasn't yet the GDR, the future GDR territory, into a mostly agricultural zone. Meanwhile, in the West, it was the opposite. They didn't remove the machinery. Instead, they protected it, poured huge investments into it, through the Marshall Plan. BMW, Mercedes, Audi, Volkswagen, Porsche, Opel. These car brands came out of old war factories converted for peacetime. And that's just cars. There were also locomotives, airplanes, medical products, and many, many more made in Germany, referring to West Germany.
So, the Soviet Union was focused on ideology, pushing some sort of socialist hopes and slogans, while the West focused on production and the economy.
I agree with everything except pushing. There were plenty of genuine initiations and enthusiasts in the GDR, and sometimes GDR even had to hold them back. At the Potsdam Conference in 1945, you had Stalin, Churchill, and Truman. They officially called their decisions the 4 Ds. Demilitarization meant stripping Germany of all military capabilities. Denazification meant tracking down and punishing key Nazi criminals, removing them from positions of power. Decentralization, here's where it gets especially interesting, called for restoring Germany's historical regions as independent federal units. Each region would have its own government and, importantly, its own constitution. And finally, the 4th D was democratization, which required holding genuinely free elections. They intended for every state to pick its own leadership and send representatives to an all-German parliament. So they split the country into states and scheduled the elections. They held them collectively, yet the results were strikingly different. In the area under Soviet control, for some reason, only pro-communist parties ended up winning. At first, it looked like there were multiple such parties, but right after the votes, they merged into one, the Socialist Unity Party of Germany. They secured 85%, forming a one-party government, and, what a coincidence, in every state they adopted constitutions, mandating the nationalization of land and factories. Essentially, they began constructing a Soviet-style socialist system.
Do you think the government had any other option? More diplomatic way to solve this problem?
Irina, that's a great question, but the answer might surprise you. The wall was actually the most diplomatic solution to this problem. West Berlin and its very existence was a major issue, not just for the USSR, but for America too. For Kennedy, it was the biggest headache he'd gladly have gotten rid of. But West Berlin was an enormous financial burden for America. It was a heavy load to keep troops there. For what? It made no sense. Honestly, West Berlin didn't provide any real benefits to the US, aside from political leverage, and those political benefits are easy to explain. As long as Berlin's status remained unclear, the division of Germany into East and West was considered temporary. Now, imagine this. If the troops were withdrawn and West Berlin was handed over to East Germany, you'd end up with a united Germany with Berlin and some obscure state on the western side. See? Even though West Berlin was a huge liability, it maintained the impression that West Germany was still part of Germany as a whole. At the Vienna summit, Kennedy and Khrushchev spoke privately about this. They spoke quiet openly, right? Kennedy explained he couldn't just let it go, and Khrushchev aggressively pressured Kennedy. In every negotiation, both official and unofficial, Kennedy said things like, let's work something out regarding Cuba, Laos. Let's talk about disarmament. We both know our nuclear stockpiles are too large. We need to bring them down. But every time, Khrushchev responded with the same answer in different forms. Berlin. Until the Berlin question is resolved, Khrushchev said, there will be no other negotiations. And now I'll tell you why the wall was the most diplomatic solution. It allowed the Americans to keep their troops in place, giving Kennedy the ability to tell Congress, look, I didn't back down, I didn't give up West Berlin, and our allies still have our support. Meanwhile, Khrushchev solved his biggest problem, stopping East Germans from fleeing to the West.
There was nothing here before. Over there, where the railway bridge is now, used to be the border zone of West Berlin. And over there, by the Autobahn, was the border with East Germany. Barbed wire, guard posts. So before stepping into the water, I smoked a cigarette and said goodbye to my entire life in East Germany. It was midnight, and To avoid being spotted, I wore a dark shirt and jeans, and I smeared oil all over my skin to minimize drag. By the way, I ended up ditching the shirt pretty quickly. It made it too hard to swim quietly and slowed me down significantly.
How far did you have to swim?
The distance to the border was just 900 meters. But as I got closer, the canal's lights grew brighter and more intense. It ended up taking me nearly 3 hours because I had to move so carefully to avoid detection. Near the bridge, I spotted an armed patrol and quickly hid in the reeds. The cold made my teeth chatter uncontrollably, so I shoved my fingers into my mouth to stop the noise from giving me away. You know, the voices of the soldiers and the heavy breathing of their dogs still haunt my nightmares even to this day. After waiting it out, I cautiously swam on. But at one point, I told myself, hold on, stop. An old man had once warned me about alarm systems above the water. In the darkness, I managed to spot the wire. If you touched it, the sirens would start blaring, the spotlights would flood the area, and the guards would immediately open fire. I took a deep breath, dove as deep as I could, and swam under the tripwires. When I surfaced again, I was already in the border zone, but that's when the worst part began. I realized there was a metal net stretching all the way down to the bottom of the canal. I knew I'd have to swim on the surface, which meant I could easily be spotted. The lighting along the border was so intense that it seemed impossible to avoid, but I must have had a guardian angel watching over me that night. I found the only patch of shadow and tore the barbed wire off the net with my bare hands so I wouldn't get caught. Either they didn't see me or it was during a guard shift change, but as soon as I got past the net, I swam as fast as I could toward the shore, and there, when I finally realized I was in the American sector, I let out a deep breath and whispered to myself, wow. I saw a car. Inside was a woman. When she saw a half-naked man, she was understandably terrified, and she screamed like, "Hau ab!" But she quickly realized I wasn't a threat, I was just freezing. She hugged me tightly to warm me up. I remember her shouting to her daughter, "Bring us something to drink. There's a refugee from the east here." The daughter handed over a bottle of brandy. I still remember the name, Dujardin. With the first sip, I lost consciousness because I was completely exhausted. When I woke up, I was already in the hospital.
How old were you?
I was 18 years old.
How did you tell your parents about it? And did you?
My parents didn't know anything about it because I didn't want to put them in danger. My father was sick, and it was important to keep him from worrying. Later, the Stasi bugged their apartment and confirmed that they weren't involved in my escape. My father even officially reported me as a missing person to avoid suspicion. When I sent them a postcard from the West, letting them know I was alive, and well, he took it straight to the police. And of course, the police immediately demanded that they convince me to stop being foolish and return home at once, threatening consequences if I didn't.
So this, look here, the biography of Karl Marx.
Oh yeah, it is a biography. You can read this one. Do you know Karl Marx?
Of course, I know Karl Marx. What else do you have here that's interesting in the library? The GDR.
Who?
Who's who in the GDR? Who's who in the GDR?
Held what position in the GDR?
An encyclopedia. Are you mentioned in this book?
No, I mean, I'm way too insignificant person for that.
But what exactly was your job?
My job was this.
What did the Ministry of Defense handle?
My job was this. Chemical support for combat operations. Things like reconnaissance and special treatments, a lot of that.
How did your organization treat people who crossed the border illegally?
If someone crossed the border illegally, they broke the law. That makes them a violator of public order. The law on state borders was something anyone could read. And if you could read, you knew it was illegal. So if I do something illegal, of course, the law applies in full power.
But did you personally consider them criminals?
I'd call them idiots.
Idiots?
Yeah, because I know it's forbidden, and yet I go ahead and do it anyway.
But can you understand these people, though?
No, I can't.
Like, if they had relatives or someone is very unhappy with this country and really wants to live somewhere else.
No, I can't. It's hard to say, to understand. You'd need to know why. What deep convictions someone has to take such a risk.
But could the regime in the country be a reason why someone flees?
No.
No?
No.
Would you work under any regime?
No, I wouldn't say that either, but I'm talking about the regime in the GDR. We lived peacefully, safely. No drugs, no constant murders. Life was calm and orderly. We didn't have unemployment or homelessness, none of that. Everyone had access to free education, free health care, everything we needed. No one was forced to flee. Every country has its laws, no matter what they are. And in that country, they're recognized and followed. I must follow them.
Do you think there are bad laws? Do you believe laws can be bad?
What do you mean by calling it bad laws?
Well, I think that when you take away people's freedom of movement, that's a bad law.
That's your opinion. Let's take an example. Imagine I'm drunk and want to drive. You tell me not to drive, but I still get behind the wheel. You call the police. Is that bad?
No, in the case you described, it's not bad. But when someone doesn't want to live in a country and they're told, no, stay here.
No. So they could have submitted a request, so they could officially emigrate.
Oh, so you could do that?
Of course.
And they wouldn't put you in jail for it?
No.
When I was 16, my parents applied for a permanent exit visa. And we don't believe in the system, and we don't appreciate the system, and they don't need us, and they kicked me out of school. I was not even allowed to step on the field. So I did track and field at this time. That was my sport. I was not even allowed to enter the sports club. This dance club was an institution. There was always, when I went to the dance club, it was always a little escape to a world which accepted me, where I could make my thing, where I had new friends. And in 1982, we took part in the East German Ballroom Championships. And at least we ranked, at the end of the day, we were the third best. So we were on the podium even. But of course, they informed us, yeah, you actually can, then I refused, and then, even the dancing was restricted and not possible. And there was also a point when I thought I need to leave. The GDR was a dictatorship, and this country ordered that people had to stay and to remain in the country. If they liked it or not was not the issue. They had to stay. Well, but there was terror, there was the shooting at the war. So first of all, I hate any kind of countries don't give their citizen a free decision. Relatively okay, but if I would have been maybe more sensitive, that could have destroyed me completely. Yeah, I mean, at this time I didn't know that they destroyed careers, professional careers, if people were not state loyal or state conform.
Well, here we are. Look, I'm parking our car.
So...
And I want to draw your attention to where we've stopped.
Yeah.
This line on the asphalt, marked with Berlin Wall, 1961 to 1989, runs through the entire city.
Did it run here, for real?
Yes, it ran right here. This is the line of the Berlin Wall. The total length of the wall stretched over 166 kilometers, with about 45 kilometers running directly through the city. These 45 kilometers that pass through the heart of the city are marked in today's Berlin. Sometimes you'll see a line like this, though it's less common. More often, it's marked with a double row of cobblestones. A distinctive kind of double stone that creates a fascinating effect. When you drive over it in a car, the wheels make a distinctive thump-thump sound. It's like you physically crossed the line of the Berlin Wall. Just a bit farther ahead, you'll notice a preserved section of the Berlin Wall still standing. This section is an authentic piece of the wall, still located where it originally stood. Of course, there are some suspicions that it might have been lifted, reinstalled, or repaired over time. But regardless, it remains a genuine original part of the wall that serves as a powerful historical reminder. Interestingly, the wall wasn't constructed exactly along the border, but was built slightly to the east. The true border between East and West Berlin runs right here. So, technically speaking, we are standing on Eastern territory. However, the wall was deliberately shifted a bit further east to avoid giving the Americans any reason to claim it was encroaching on their sector. This area, while officially part of East Berlin, wasn't directly controlled by the authorities. Everything under their strict control began on the other side of the wall. Beyond the wall, there was additional eastern territory, but it was a terrifying no man's land, a deadly strip where anyone who dared to enter was shot without hesitation. This zone wasn't just an empty field. It was filled with an overwhelming number of obstacles designed to stop anyone from crossing. There was barbed wire, electrified fences, sharp spiked grids on the ground, water-filled ditches, plowed strips for tracking footsteps, and even a dedicated patrol zone. However, the most terrifying feature of this area was the guard tower. One of those towers used to stand right here. These towers lined the entire perimeter of the wall and were manned by GDR soldiers, who were instructed to shoot and kill anyone who stepped into the restricted zone.
Ja, terug. Hallo agenda. Alles klar? Dann gehen wir mal hinter, ja? Gehen wir rein.
I became a soldier when I turned 18. At that time, the government was looking for volunteers to serve in border and internal troops. Back then, I lived alone with my retired mother because my father had passed away in 1956. My mother said, "My dear boy, you can do as you wish." So I signed a contract to serve in the border troops. At first, I was an assistant to the commander, then became a commander myself, and later I was in charge of an entire regiment. Before long, I became the top official here, the commander-in-chief of the border service for the central part of the GDR. The soldiers serving in our unit had one specific task: to guard the GDR border. Crossing the border illegally was considered a crime. A soldier on duty wasn't supposed to stop and think, is this a person running to reunite with their family in the West? Or is this a criminal trying to escape punishment for murder or robbery committed in the GDR? The person standing guard had to have one thought in mind. If you see someone breaking the law, you must shoot without hesitation.
Have you ever used your service weapon?
I could only use it if my life was in immediate danger. I mean real danger. Otherwise, I had to give a verbal warning first, then fire a warning shot, and only then aim to injure, specifically at the legs or lower body, as was required by the rules.
Of course, there was a strict ban on shooting at children or pregnant women. But think about it. How could a soldier standing guard at night tell if the person running in the dark was a child or a pregnant woman? Besides, every soldier always strove to fulfill their duty to protect the border, and we were very conscientious citizens.
We're standing on the eastern shore, and over there is the western shore. At this point, the border ran along the canal, which, a bit further down, flows out of the Spree River. On the eastern side, this area was known as the shoot-to-kill zone. There was a watchtower here on the eastern side. It's authentic, it's still standing today. From this tower, guards used to shoot and kill people. And today, in this tower, the former, watchtower, Now, the former GDR watchtower has been turned into a memorial dedicated to Günter Littfen. Günter was the first victim of the Berlin Wall. He was the first person to be shot while trying to cross into West Berlin. A talented fashion designer. He was young, just 22 years old, if I'm not mistaken. His work was so remarkable that actors in West Berlin used his services, and his costumes were even commissioned for opera productions. In East Berlin, however, his future was limited to working on an assembly line in a GDR garment factory, earning a mediocre salary. You can imagine why he started transitioning to life in West Berlin. He had already set up a small atelier, rented a room, and even a modest apartment. He and his brother were renovating the place. He was just days away from moving there permanently when tragedy struck. But on one weekend, with the renovation almost finished, he was spending time with his family in East Berlin. It was the weekend of August 12th to 13th, 1961, the night the wall was built. Waking up on the morning of August 13th, he realized he could no longer return to West Berlin. For several days he scouted the wall, walking back and forth, searching for a way to cross. A bit further upstream, there was a railway bridge. He noticed that when trains passed, the border guards only monitored one side of the train, completely ignoring the other. He decided to run behind a train, hoping to go unnoticed. He made his attempt, but the train was moving too fast. The guards spotted him, shouted, and he leapt into the water, intending to swim to the other shore. The first bullet hit his shoulder. It wasn't a fatal wound. What happened next sparked outrage across all the West Berlin. Wounded, he raised his hands, signaling his surrender. From the bridge, laughter rang out, followed by several shots to his head and neck, ending his life instantly. I recall the stories about how guards were supposedly instructed to aim for the legs, but here they fired straight at his head and chest without any warning from the silence of their hiding places. There are far too many GDR records that corroborate what happened that day.
When a soldier was given an order, they could have chosen not to follow it and refused to shoot those people, couldn't they?
You were obligated to fulfill your military duty to the homeland. During military training, every soldier was asked if they were prepared to use weapons while on duty. If a soldier answered, "No, I'm not ready," they were deemed unfit for border service. In other words, even during the preparation phase, soldiers had to fully understand the weight of the responsibility placed on them, including the political responsibility that came with it.
This circle of red granite marks a place where a tragic amount of human blood was spilled, all of it because of one single person. His name was Peter Fechter. He was a young man, Czech, based on his years of life, only 18 years old. A simple builder, a mason from the GDR, and decided to flee to West Berlin. It happened during a time when the death strip hadn't yet been established. There was only one wall. It seemed almost too simple. Just jump over and you'd be free. Peter and another young man made their attempt together. The first man was lucky. He jumped, fell, and managed to reach the other side. He made it to West Berlin. Peter, however, was just a few seconds behind. Peter Fechter was hit by 35 bullets all at once. He fell on the eastern side. He was still alive, desperately calling for help for an hour and a half. For an hour and a half, no one came. Today in Berlin, there stands a memorial to him. It bears the inscription, Peter Fechter, 1944 to 62. He just wanted freedom.
Do you condemn the SS officers?
Of course.
And what if I tell you the same thing you're telling me? They were just following orders and acting under the laws of the country they lived in.
Well, fine, as long as they were within Germany, whatever, they could do what they wanted. But the SS acted criminally during the war. That has to be said. Has to be said. But if I am the GDR didn't attack anyone, so...
What if we talk about an ordinary SS soldier or officer who...
The SS was a voluntary organization. It means that I, or anyone else who joined, did so willingly. They knew exactly where they were going to the SS.
But wait a moment, are you saying that in your time people didn't join your ministry or the Stasi voluntarily?
They joined voluntarily, but we didn't kill anyone. We didn't commit any war crimes.
No, we are not. I'm not talking those who started a war. I'm talking about how a soldier was forced to shoot at escapees or open fire on demonstrators because those were the laws and we were just following orders. The SS said the same thing,
all right.
Obeying the law, so to speak.
All right, let me remind you of this. As a soldier, I have the right to refuse an order. If this order is against humanity, if an order is inhumane, I can say, I won't do it. That's it. Did they say no? No. They killed. They could have said no, but they didn't. But they did it.
Do you condemn those who pulled the trigger? Your colleagues?
They were fulfilling their duty.
But what's the difference?
What they did wasn't a crime?
But the SS, that was a crime.
Of course. If you're killing innocent civilians, it's a crime.
I honestly had no idea how to handle my emotions when I found myself talking to that colonel from the Ministry of Defense and a border patrol soldier. I mean, I understand back in the GDR they had strict laws and they were under orders to shoot, to kill. That was the system they lived in. But I always wonder, don't you always have a choice? You could decide not to shoot directly at a person. You could fire into the air instead, claim you missed, and spare someone's life. Yet here's this man, passionately condemning the SS officers, calling their actions horrible crimes against humanity. But isn't he guilty of committing crimes against humanity too? Think about those Stasi officers or those GDR soldiers. They weren't just shooting random strangers. They were shooting their own people, who simply had the bad luck of being born on the wrong side of the border in the place they didn't choose.
In 1972, amnesty was introduced for all GDR refugees, allowing them to safely visit their families back home without fear. It was 6 years after I fled when I saw my parents again for the first time. That's also when I decided on a new path in life. I started helping people escape to the West. The first time, I helped someone plan the escape of his girlfriend. After that, it snowballed, one person after another. Every time it was someone's brother, sister, or loved one. Using a car for escape was probably the easiest and safest method at the time. Digging tunnels was incredibly risky and labor-intensive. You could get caught at any moment, but with a car, it was simple. Hide someone in the trunk and drive. Trunks were never checked, and that made it the perfect solution. Escape attempts were expensive. Specialized organizations charged up to 30,000 Deutsche Marks per person. Initially, you'd pay an advance of about 10,000. If the escape failed, the money wasn't refunded. I earned well and even managed to buy myself a car. In total, I helped 33 people escape. Over time, prices naturally went up because the Stasi kept coming up with new and more sophisticated control methods. They weren't stupid. They developed infrared devices and lasers that could scan parked cars and detect escapees.
When was that exact moment when you told yourself, I am going to escape now?
I remember that something really inspired me. It was in 1980 that I got a West German journal. It's called Stern. It still exists. And there was a story, and the parents, they created a balloon. And they also built up a basket for 8 persons. And they installed the self-made balloon. The first time, the balloon dropped, but in East Germany. So they tried to escape, but again, they dropped, but just behind the border. just behind the border in West Germany. So they made it. And I read this. It read like a really thrilling report. And it was so inspiring. I thought if families with even little shit leave from East to West Germany, they didn't try it by crossing the border between East and West Germany. They definitely didn't try to cross the wall in Berlin. They crossed the border from Hungary to Austria. And it was something which started to take place in my mind, and
So, what was the plan?
East German, we could cross the border to Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was the only country in the world which we could visit without visa. Him in Hungary, and then we wanted to escape. That when before the train crosses the border, that people come into the train asking for the train ticket and for the ID. And then he looked at me and he said, "Show me your return ticket." Mm-hmm. And I had none. And then 4 men in grey uniforms and even machine guns came into the train, opened the door, and they immediately found it. They opened the seam and they even cut it off everything in my backpacker. They found a little compass, a little binocular. And there was someone take a seat in opposite, and I couldn't see a face, I only saw a shape. And this guy asked me if I want to escape. And I answered, no, of course not. Realized it doesn't matter what I answer. He is always asking the same question again and again. Always, wollen Sie die DDR illegal verlassen? I need to sleep, or I mean, the time was passing. I can't say how long it took, but there was probably the 5th, 6th or 7th person opposite always asking the same question. And then I said, yes, I want to escape.
We were transported in food delivery trucks with big advertisement boards on the sides that said things like, "Eat more fresh fish, fruits, and vegetables." Inside, as you can see, there were 5 compartments, so they could transport about 5 people at a time. We sat inside the truck, of course, handcuffed, and the smell of gasoline was overwhelming. It was awful. The stench was so strong that it was almost impossible to breathe. We kept thinking, oh my God, let's just get to the destination already.
Do you remember the moment you were caught?
It happened in March 1975. Honestly, I was incredibly nervous before the operation. I was driving along the highway toward Hamburg, and this part of the GDR had a lot of Soviet military corps stationed there. Normally, I never encountered searches, but this time, as I approached the border, they directed me to turn right toward a garage. I wasn't expecting that at all. I turned into the garage, and a man with a dog came in. The dog, with its sharp sense of smell, of course, detected the scent of people in the car. In my trunk were my sister and her boyfriend. They pushed me up against the wall and pressed a gun barrel to my back. I remember saying, also, go ahead, shoot me. At that moment, I really meant it.
Of course, we can talk endlessly about these cases of escapees, but the truth is, most people lived in the GDR, built their careers, and I think for many that was enough. It's fascinating to talk to people who didn't resist, who just accepted things. Were they simply resigned to it, or were they genuinely satisfied with their lives?
Monika, was ist das?
Solyanka.
Solyanka.
Russian solyanka.
Solyanka, is that a Russian recipe?
I don't think it is Russian recipe.
I just bought a pre-made soup and added German sausages to it. I don't know if they make it like that in Russia. Maybe they add meat. No idea.
How did you two meet?
We just celebrated 22 years of marriage, but we actually met even earlier, 24 years ago. It happened in Leipzig, introduced by mutual friends.
Was it like that in East Germany? Did everyone want to marry a West German because it was considered prestigious, since they lived better and earned more?
No. GDR girls didn't have the goal of marrying someone from the West. Well, for example, I was financially independent, I had good housing, and I didn't have extravagant demands. I had everything I needed. I'm grateful for the system we had in the GDR because it gave me so much. I received a free higher education, something Western Germans can't really brag about. The only thing I envied a little was their ability to travel freely. But we also traveled. We vacationed in Bulgaria and Hungary, although I always dreamed of visiting neighboring Austria because I love skiing. But here, we didn't always even have snow.
Did you believe in the idea of socialism? Did you think it was possible? And did you like the idea of that political system?
Yes, I believed in socialism. Even today, I think it's a good system. It encourages you to care about others. After Germany was reunited, I had the opportunity to work with Western colleagues. They would often tell me that we, Eastern Germans, should value our ability to work together harmoniously, because in the West, people only think about themselves. Let me give you an example. Right after the wall fell, I visited my cousin in Karlsruhe, and we went to a pub. I didn't have any money at the time because GDR currency wasn't accepted. My cousin ordered food for himself and his wife. But I sat there from 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. without any food or drinks. Toward the end of the evening, he finally asked if I'd like a glass of beer. I couldn't hold back anymore and said, "Honestly, I'm really hungry. I haven't eaten anything yet." And he, as if nothing was wrong, replied, "Well, what do you want from us? Buy yourself something." At that moment, I understood everything about Western egocentrism.
We Eastern Germans often smile when Westerners boast about their latest advancements in human rights. The truth is, we'd already introduced and implemented many of those ideas in the East long before. For example, universal access to education. In the GDR, it was guaranteed for everyone. Today, in unified Germany, there are 16 federal states, each with its own school system. A degree you earn in Munich might not even be recognized in Hamburg or Lower Saxony. In this era of globalization, that's just mind-boggling.
When you lived in the GDR, did you feel as a citizen that you were protected, that the government cared for you? Did you feel it?
We had jobs, and in terms of food, we were more or less provided for. But, of course, when it came to expensive items, the situation in our country was very difficult. You always had to wait for things. For example, you had to sign up on a waiting list. Cars, for instance, took 10 to 12 years to get, and it was the same with many other things, like household appliances. I never ended up getting an apartment from my employer, despite waiting for years, and buying one, that was simply out of the question.
Well, let's talk about Trabants.
They clearly weren't this color back in the day.
I wouldn't bet on it though, because I don't like talking about things I'm not 100% sure of. Maybe someone did have one like that. But let's put it this way, it was the most common car for people in East Germany, so it's possible someone decided to paint it pink.
Was it common because it was popular or because there was nothing else?
Because it was the only option. It was the only car available to East Germans. It's actually a unique car. It's made of plastic, literally a plastic body, and it has a two-stroke motorcycle engine. Do you know what a two-stroke engine is? With a button. Let's try it out. Want to sit inside? Let's take a seat. Let's give it a try.
This is plastic, seriously. This thing is a box made for killing people.
If I started it up right now, you'd be even more amazed because it has a two-stroke motorcycle engine. Let me explain what that is. I can see the keys, but they didn't let me start it myself. But I can still show you how it works. It shakes. It stinks terribly because you had to mix oil into the fuel. The car did have one big advantage. It was cheap. It was affordable for any family in East Germany. It cost 5,500 East German marks. The average salary was about 2,000 marks. So basically it was roughly equivalent to a monthly paycheck. But this advantage came with a huge downside, the wait list. The queue for a Trabant was 10 to 13 years long. Now imagine an 18-year-old guy in East Germany He's just finished school and is looking at his future. In East Germany, he'd get a job and sign up for the Trabant waitlist, hoping that maybe in 10 years, if he's lucky, he could buy one. Meanwhile, just down the street in West Berlin, he could escape, get a job, and on the same day, with a signed contract, get an interest-free loan and buy himself, if not a Mercedes, then a Volkswagen, Opel or Audi. He'd be driving it that same year, meeting girls and living life, instead of waiting 10 years for a Trabant. Any more questions about why they decided to leave?
I ran out of questions the moment I sat in this car, honestly. I get that it's old, but still.
Ooh, you know what?
I've sat in other retro cars before. Was there corruption in East Germany?
Of course, there was corruption in East Germany, but it was different. For example, if you were the head of a factory and somehow ended up with your own private country house, people would start whispering behind your back. Well, we all know how they got that. There were people involved in shady dealings, like managing car distributions or having access to other scarce goods. Bartering became a big thing because money didn't mean much in East Germany. But a crate of rare beer, that could get you a box of coffee. Nowadays, no one's surprised by hackers. They can dig up info on banks, companies or websites. But East Germany had its own version of hackers. They'd sneak into allocation systems to see how many spots were reserved for kids in summer pioneer camps or at holiday resorts. Then they'd tweak the numbers for themselves. When you don't have money, you have to get creative to solve your problems.
East Germany ranked among the top 10 most developed countries in the world. That means tremendous effort went into...
Are you saying what exactly?
Into economy.
Who came up with that ranking?
It's not my claim, it was the official ranking back then.
What year was that?
Before the early 1980s.
East Germany was in the top 10 most developed countries in the world?
Yes.
Are you sure?
I'm absolutely sure.
Did the dictatorship ever bother you? No freedom of the press? No freedom of choice? And constant surveillance within your own country?
Let's start with surveillance. East Germany had 17 million residents. Surveillance, who was doing it? The Stasi, as you'd call them. How many staff members did they have? Several 100,000. It's impossible for them to watch everyone, of course. It's impossible. Well, of course.
But sorry to interrupt, how come, as we know, when people visit the Stasi archives, they always seem to find detailed records about themselves, huge volumes of them?
Well, of course. There's something on me in there too, I'm sure. I haven't looked, but I chose a profession. That involved handling weapons and secret documents. Naturally, they'd have to check. Of course, they're supposed to be checking.
Well, but what about regular people? You're a different case, obviously.
Regular people.
So they weren't
in
being
my
watched?
family. I can say with a high degree of certainty that no one was being watched. Why would they be? They were just ordinary people. No reason to spy on them. So if someone wanted to travel to the West, then yes, they had to be checked to make sure they'd come back.
Well, I have an interesting document here for you. Look at this. After Germany's reunification, people who worked in East German state institutions had to prove they weren't involved with the Stasi. That information was kept in the archives. So, people had to request their records and provide all the details about themselves.
Does that exist for every citizen of East Germany?
No, not for everyone. A person only came under the Stasi's radar in specific cases. For example, if someone tried to find work in the West through relatives, that's when they were closely monitored.
Udo, were you surprised by anything in your file, something the Stasi knew about you that you hadn't even suspected?
It turned out that my personal file included copies of letters my wife had written to relatives in the West, as well as letters she'd received from them. So, the Stasi was opening our mail, reading it, copying it and storing it, because there was no law protecting the privacy of correspondence back then. The procedure was quite simple. They'd open the envelopes, copy the letters, and then send the envelopes with the letters back through regular German mail. This way the Secret Service could, for instance, learn if people were dissatisfied with their lives, unhappy with their jobs, or dreaming of a better salary for the party. This was extremely valuable information. There were certain things you absolutely couldn't write about under the threat of arrest: the army, the police, Soviet soldiers, or any military-related information. Those topics were completely off limits, absolutely taboo.
When it comes to the entire security apparatus of East Germany, from the Ministry of Defense to the Stasi, was it scarier than the KGB?
Yes, you know, I thought about it. Who am I to judge or compare? I'm not even a professional historian. But I will say this: yes, it was scarier. And the answer is quite simple. Watch the movie The Lives of Others.
The Lives of Others.
The Lives of Others.
Great movie.
Let me add something here. It's something that's being talked about a lot today in East Germany. In that movie, they're installing microphones in his apartment during the construction process. He lives in an old building, in an old neighborhood. When new buildings were being constructed, microphones were placed right into the walls. So you might not be being listened to right now. Maybe your mic is off, but they knew that every wall had a mic, and if they wanted to, they could always listen in on you. Technically, in East Germany, it was practically impossible to keep anything completely secret. They discuss complicated issues at picnics, but never in the kitchen.
When we talk about 1937, I understand. Stalin was in power, and he feared everyone. Enemies everywhere, terrorists. But who was that person in East Germany? Erich Honecker, who was so afraid of regular people?
They weren't afraid. They did what everyone does, like Stalin, like others we won't name. They all wanted to maintain the power structure they had. They feared any kind of change. They'd say that change would bring disaster, so they worked to hold on to power. When the people no longer wanted them, harsh repressive systems were used. The goal was to stay in control. Honecker was one of the smartest people, at least among those I've studied. He understood perfectly well that without this system of suppression, there would be no East Germany.
Was this your cell?
Yes, I spent 11 months here. This was my number. There was one bed here, another over there. In the corner there's a toilet, and across from it a sink. That's all there was in the cell.
What color were the walls back then?
Let me think. I believe they were like this.
What was the daily routine like?
It was boring. They'd wake us up at 6 a.m. and give us breakfast, then we'd just sit there all day. Even having a book was a privilege. Sometimes they'd put someone in the cell with me, but they were always informants. I'd tell them all sorts of nonsense, like that Honecker, the leader of the Socialist Party in East Germany, had an illegitimate son, and that I supposedly helped him escape to West Germany. I said those things to the informants so they'd send me back to the investigator's office. It was like a lounge, warm and cozy. In the investigator's office, you could get a cup of coffee or even a letter from home. It was the only bit of variety I had. And then there were the walks.
This is the yard for walks. 2 by 3 meters. Once a day, they take you out here for 20 minutes to get some fresh air and finally see the sky, through bars, of course.
I got 10 months in prison, that was my sentence. There I had to share the cell with 17 other men. 3 floor beds, only 1 toilet, 1 water place, so it was absolutely degrading. There was a square where we could spend half an hour or an hour per day. There I met another prisoner, and he came to me and he said, I'm watching you, and you are always looking down and you never look up. There's the sky, there are clouds, something that's... And then I looked into his face, and he was funny. It's hard to believe, but to see him once a day was so great. I looked forward 23 hours to meeting him up later on and to talk with him. And we are still best friends, though he's not always nice to me because he's my dentist.
Did you know who stayed in this cell?
There were all kinds of people here. For a couple of months, a very sweet girl was in this cell. We used to tap messages to each other. She was caught trying to cross from Hungary into Austria. We became friends.
Do you remember the tapping system? What was it? Was it letters? Morse code? What was it?
Yes, something like Morse code.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
Look at my hand. See how steady it is? Of course I wanted to see that girl, my neighbor, but it was impossible. Sometimes when they took me out for a walk, I'd step a little over the forbidden lines, breaking the rules just a bit, in the hope of catching a glimpse of her. That could get you thrown into solitary confinement. Once, for doing exactly that, I spent 5 days in the punishment cell, but it was worth it. I caught a glimpse of her profile. Just that moment was enough to drive you mad.
And here it is, the Stasi-era punishment cell. 1.5 by 1 meter. They'd lock a person in here for 24 hours in total darkness, with no food or water. You could either sit on the concrete floor or stand. That was it. Those were your entertainments. You could end up here for tapping messages to your neighbor or arguing with a guard. Nowadays, though, this room is part of the museum. It's a coat closet or a utility room for the cleaning staff. You can come in, change clothes, and go to work. Thank goodness.
I was sentenced to 15 years. The charge was human trafficking. From East Germany's perspective, it was, of course, complete nonsense, because they were the ones selling us for outrageous amounts of money to the Western authorities.
East Germany was always, run always out of cash. The problem is the idea of the Ostblock was they can organize everything, and they needed money from the West. And one thing, so they made up their mind how can we make valuta currency. And one idea was to sell political opponents.
In 1975, when Honecker signed the Helsinki Accords, there was a clause, I think it was point 3, that stated that East German citizens could decide for themselves which side they wanted to live on. People who knew about this naturally started pushing for their rights, gathering the necessary documents to legally move to West Germany. But the Stasi, on their end, tried to turn these people into criminals. They'd fabricate charges, throw them in prison. Only then could they profit from selling that person.
Started to sell political opponents in 1963, and they did it until the end of East Germany. So, and West Germany, of course, said, okay, from a humane point of view, 1,000 political prisoners between 61, not that many, but for East Germany was a business, so they made a lot of.
Toward the end of East Germany's existence, they charged about 100,000 Deutsche Marks per person. That's roughly $50,000. And if you were a scientist or an academic, the price was even higher. Over the years, the West German government spent around 3.5 billion Deutsche Marks on political prisoners.
My grandparents that I'm imprisoned, and then my grandparents contacted a lawyer in Bonn, which was the capital of West Germany. And he took contact to this lawyer in East Berlin, and he put me on the list. And from this list, East Germany sold the prisoners and fill in a form to be re-entered, to be replaced in the East German society, or to give up my citizenship. And I decided to give up my citizenship because actually my mother supported me in English language, but also in my native language. Sometimes there are situations you can't explain in words because it's such a strong feeling, and I'm missing words in any language. So it was such a great, remarkable, and amazing moment I will never forget.
In your opinion, why do you think the wall eventually fell?
I think it was a mistake by East Germany's ruling party. They were so old and so out of touch with reality that they had no idea what was really happening with the people. When we saw our aging politicians speaking from the podium, there was a joke among the people that behind them stood some kind of support bar, holding them up so they wouldn't fall.
Were there any specific examples like did Honecker give interviews or visit places, like a new school, and from what he said, where something he said in that moment made you realize they had no idea about the conditions their people were living in?
People were truly living a different reality than the politicians. Officials only cared about making sure their leader saw the good side of things. It was like a Potemkin village. For instance, during an official visit from a leader or delegation, the streets would suddenly be tidied up, asphalt patched, and buildings given a quick coat of paint. Then the delegation would arrive and see how beautiful everything was, thinking, what more could these people want? Meanwhile, only 5 houses on the street were painted, and behind them, everything was completely neglected.
A small detail, could something like that happen in Germany today?
In modern Germany, something like that is, of course, impossible. People notice things right away. If something's wrong on the street, if something's broken or needs repairs, and relatively quickly, the work gets started. It doesn't matter if it falls under a municipal organization or is the responsibility of the federal government. Today, there are very strict standards for how work is carried out and tight controls over how money is spent.
Der Klang des gemeinsamen Singens in den Kirchen. Der Ruf nach der Sonne der Gerechtigkeit und der alte Hoffnungsgesang, we shall overcome.
Do you feel anything every year when November begins? Or are these just ordinary days for you now?
I still feel very strong emotions. This day isn't just important for East Germans or the eastern regions, it's important for all of Europe, for the world. Back then, I never missed a single protest. In the beginning, it all seemed pointless. There were barely 1,000 of us. Then it grew to 20,000, then 70,000. And on October 9th, 1989, a month before the wall fell, around 200,000 of us gathered here near the theater. It's such a powerful feeling. I helped make the world freer, helped tear down borders. It's amazing. We were all holding candles back then. We weren't protesting. We were praying for freedom, just holding hands, and we simply walked.
In front of you is the Ministry of Justice of the Federal Republic of Germany. It was in this very hall that the historic event leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall took place. This happened on November 9th, 1989. On that day, Günter Schabowski held a press conference for Western journalists. He announced the new laws adopted by the GDR. Of course, the circumstances were pressing, and new measures had to be taken as tensions were escalating. The protests in Leipzig and Dresden had heightened the situation, and society was already mobilized. Everyone was stirred by Mikhail Gorbachev's statement that those who failed to understand the necessity of reforms would become their victims. Erich Honecker was removed from office. A new East German government was preparing reforms, but they kept delaying their implementation. In this room, Günter Schabowski stepped up to speak to Western journalists and announced East Germany's new laws. Among them was the law on the freedom of movement for East German citizens. The law stated that anyone could now apply for travel documents, something that previously was limited to specific groups, and that these documents would be processed without delays. The idea was that people would begin applying for travel permits the next day and start leaving the country gradually. But Gunter Schabowski hadn't even read the law. It had been passed that very day and shoved into his briefing folder. During the press conference, an Italian journalist stood up and asked, "Mr. Schabowski, I don't quite understand. Does this mean that East German citizens now have the right to freely travel abroad?" A confused Schabowski looked up and replied, "As far as I understand, yes." That sentence shook the foundation of the wall. The journalist pressed further, "Mr. Schabowski, when does this law take effect?" And it was at that very moment that he said the famous phrase, "Look, here it is written in German. As I understand it, this takes effect immediately." The law came into effect right then and there. This segment from the interview featuring Schabowski's phrase began airing every half hour on West German and West Berlin television, broadcasts that, of course, everyone in the GDR was watching. Suddenly, people poured into the streets. They all rushed to the wall, joyfully shouting to the border guards, "Schabowski just announced it on TV." The wall was equipped with water cannons. They could have dispersed an even larger crowd, but the border guards themselves were confused. They turned on their TVs, saw the same interview, and didn't activate the water cannons. The crowd pressed closer, and at that point, there was nothing left to do.
Follow the Moskwa down to Gonky Park, listening to the wind of change.
Yes, many people think this song is about the fall of the Berlin Wall, but strangely enough, it's actually about Moscow. I wrote it based on the emotions I felt in Russia in August 1989, when we were finally allowed to perform a concert there. Just a year earlier, we were banned from playing in Leningrad, and now it was possible. The concert lasted 2 nights, and in total, 200,000 people came to see us from all over the Soviet Union and even from East Germany. Of course, such lyrics could have been written by anyone at the time. They could have come to mind for Bon Jovi, Motley Crue, or Ozzy Osbourne. We were all on the same stage, all equally stunned that we played real rock in the Soviet Union. But for us, Germans, it was a bit different. To put it metaphorically, imagine a sky that had been covered with dark clouds for so long, and then, suddenly, a strong beam of sunlight breaks through, scattering the clouds.
For me, it was an extraordinary moment, pure euphoria. I couldn't believe that in an instant. A whole world of opportunities opened up for me. Today, my ballet company has 40 members, representing more than 20 different nationalities and cultures. It enriches the theatre so much. This is the kind of freedom I fought for.
And these holes, who made them? It must have been hard work. What did they use to break it?
Great question. That was a business. These guys were called wall woodpeckers. In 1990, they were here with sturdy chisels and heavy sledgehammers, chipping off pieces of the wall to sell. They'd sell small pieces right on the spot. 2 Deutsche Marks for a tiny fragment and 5 Deutsche Marks for a decent-sized one. That was serious money at the time. More than today's 5 euros, much more.
And the souvenir pieces they sell now? A piece of the Berlin Wall?
With a certificate, no less.
Fake?
You know, I can't outright accuse them of fraud. They claim these are genuine pieces of the wall, that there's some mythical warehouse where all the slabs were stored, and they chip off little bits from there. It's a story that's been told so many times people barely question it anymore. But one German journalist did some detailed math and eventually figured out that if you added up all these pieces, you could rebuild 10 or 20 massive walls, not just around Berlin, but practically around the entire globe.
In 1990, a year later, I wanted to see the wall. I wanted to see how they were tearing it down, how it was all happening. I arrived feeling like a winner. The wall was down. We, the democratic forces, had won. It was amazing. I was on such a high. On the western side, all along the wall, there were vendors selling pieces of it, he told slowly, in American English. Small ones. Right there, yes. They were also selling hats, pins, whatever else you could imagine. It quickly turned into a marketplace. My brain did the math, converted it to rubles. Crazy money. I thought, thanks guys. Turned around, browsed a bit more, and eventually picked out a medium-sized piece that felt just right, something I instantly knew would fit perfectly in my pocket and stay with me always. Wow. And now it's 2019, and here it is, lying right in front of us. That very same piece from 1990.
Do you have a fridge magnet?
No.
On principle?
It matters to me because all these magnets, they're counterfeit. People just make them themselves. Not exactly counterfeit, but what's the word?
Do you not receive royalties from them?
No. There's a German law about public spaces. In the US, I'd be a billionaire. In Russia, I'd also be a billionaire. And to be precise, no one would be producing all these items like magnets because they'd have to pay me royalties. It's ironic, really, especially when you consider how much profit they're making without ever compensating the original creators. But here, there's a law that says anything in a public space can be used by anyone, and in 2017 this was reaffirmed in court. So, I see it as absolutely fantastic free advertising for my work, and a way to reach people I never could otherwise. Only dead people like Leonardo da Vinci, Picasso, Salvador Dali, or Andy Warhol get those royalties because their works have been mass-produced for years. For us alive, it doesn't apply.
When you were unexpectedly invited as an artist to paint something on the eastern side of the wall for the first time, was that some kind of adventure for you, or did you understand how symbolic it was?
Starting with Sotheby's in '88, when the works of an underground artist were first officially priced, Grisha Bruskin's works sold for an incredible £450,000, a sum that was absolutely unheard of for Soviet artists at the time, and it was like, wow, like what even is that kind of money? We went from being completely penniless to, in that moment, practically the richest people in all of Russia. And of course, that had a huge impact on everything. Before that, my buyers and fans were just my friends. Friends who could maybe scrape together enough to buy something for 25 Soviet rubles, or if they really had the means, maybe 100, but then everything shifted. That's true. Suddenly, wealthy foreigners started showing up out of nowhere, offering $100 and even $1,000, sums that felt completely crazy and unimaginable to us back then. So naturally, when I got a call saying, a gallery owner from Berlin is coming to see you, I couldn't help but feel excited and nervous at the same time. And then, when the door opened and he walked in, I suddenly heard Russian being spoken. Damn, well, yeah.
Not going to pay.
Exactly, yeah. But then it turned out to be Alexander Berdovsky, a former tour guide and translator from Berlin. I mean, East. So he decided to get into contemporary art. The first thing he said to me when he opened the door was, Dima, there's a wall. That's literally how it happened, exactly as it unfolded. There was this small trailer on wheels, fully stocked with paints, brushes, jars for mixing colors, and everything an artist might need. Inside sat a confident woman from Scotland. She said, I'm in charge here. I decide who gets to paint on the Berlin Wall. Sasha was Soviet from East Germany, and I was just Soviet. Naturally, where there's a spot to paint, there has to be someone in charge. There's no such thing as a place without a boss. And a Western boss. Wow. That was something else. On top of that, she called herself a gallerist. For any Soviet underground artist, getting into a gallery was the ultimate dream. Then she said, you need to sign a contract. That was the second dream, signing a contract with a gallery. What more could you possibly want? Of course, the Berlin Wall didn't officially belong to anyone, so anyone could paint on it.
But the contract was in German.
No, it was in English, a language neither I nor Sasha could read. The contract stated that all rights, forever, to everything I painted and everything all the other artists painted would belong to this Scottish woman. I only found out about this when I reread the contract 3 years later.
Amazing.
She said, "What are you going to paint? I need to know, because I'm the boss."
Yeah.
Later, thank goodness, it turned out she had worked for the Stasi at one point. She was labeled persona non grata and all that came with it.
And she quickly found herself a new job.
Yes. So I started thinking about what to paint. The thing is, I already had a project planned. It was called God Help Me Survive This Deadly Love. It featured 5 different kisses, each carefully chosen for its distinct character. One of them was inspired by an Italian leather goods advertisement, which I found absolutely fascinating. And one of the kisses, of course, was Brezhnev and Honecker, the one that everyone remembers. God, help me survive this deadly love, dedicated to all those little kisses. That's where the image came from. It was inspired by a rather complicated and intense moment in my life. Back in '88, during one of my apartment exhibitions, a wonderful girl named Sarah Fernandez from the American Embassy appeared, and we started a romance right there in Moscow. At the time, as always, Soviet-American relations were incredibly tense, and Sarah had to write a report for the FBI after every single one of our meetings. On my end, there was an entirely different kind of tension. Sarah didn't believe for the longest time that the KGB was also watching us. She kept saying, "No, that's impossible." But then, in May of '89, her term at the embassy ended, and she left. A few months later, in September, I went to Paris for the first time in my life. Sarah and I exchanged heartfelt letters, dreaming about finally meeting up in Paris or maybe somewhere in Switzerland. I unexpectedly crossed paths with a fascinating girl from St. Petersburg named Alina. And from that moment on, everything in my life began to shift in ways I could never have imagined. On one side, there was Alina, and on the other, Sarah. It felt like I was trapped between 2 lips. That's where the plea, "God, help me survive this deadly love," came from. It's all about love, of course, but the kind of love that scars your soul. No one knew what would happen next. Everyone was scared. All the East Germans fled to the West, terrified that the borders might close again at any moment. Who knew what Gorbachev might decide? All my friends naturally headed for West Berlin. Each of them said, "Are you crazy? West Berlin is where the galleries are, the art dealers, the money, the opportunities. Everyone loves us because it's perestroika." They'd say, "You're painting on a wall that'll be torn down in a month." But for some reason, I wasn't in a rush to leave. I felt like there was something important about staying right where I was, even if it didn't make sense to anyone else. Of course, it was obvious the wall would fall, but I just kept doing my thing, ignoring all of it completely. Honestly, I don't know why. I can't explain it.
Didn't they pay you anything at all for it?
No, on the contrary, they could have easily taken it if they wanted. If they said it was worth 100 marks or even more, we would have gladly paid it.
In the fall of 1990, we all went on leave, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit us. That's when GDR arrests gained momentum. Many people received prison sentences and had to serve time behind bars. Eventually, they turned their attention to me as well and started interrogating me too. During questioning, I saw killers, soldiers who had killed people at the border. I sat there, unable to understand what claims they could possibly have against me. I was charged with the involuntary manslaughter of 4 people, all because I allegedly signed an order allowing soldiers to shoot people trying to escape. But in reality, it was simply an order instructing soldiers to prevent escapes. In the end, I got 3 years and 3 months. I served my time in a Berlin prison, sharing a cell block with high-ranking GDR officials, including notable figures like Defense Minister Kessler. There were other important officials as well, influential individuals who made sure that the conditions of our imprisonment were adjusted to be as comfortable as possible for us. The prison guards treated us humanely, very politely. They even said outright, "Don't worry, we'll look after you. Nothing will happen to you while you're here." I can't say that my time in this prison was a terrible or unbearable experience. Everything was fairly lenient toward us. It was even somewhat enjoyable and entertaining at times. But the most unpleasant thing came later. I received a letter from the investigative committee stating that I had to cover the court expenses, 30,000 euros. And, only this May, after many years, did I finally pay off the final 150 euros of that debt.
Where are we? What is this place?
We're standing in the office of an organization that focuses on providing humane and material support for individuals who have suffered from persecution. So, this place is both a sanctuary and a resource hub.
So, former military officers, Stasi members, and other people.
Military
Who else do you
personnel,
help?
police officers, lawyers, they come from various backgrounds. The majority of ISOR's members are former members or employees of the Ministry of State Security, people who once served in one of the most influential organizations of its time.
And how do you support these people?
We spoke. You had a conversation earlier today with Colonel Leo personally, who openly discussed the aftermath of his trial and shared his story in great detail. He was forced to pay a substantial sum, I don't know how much, that greatly impacted him financially. Despite the burden, he gets occasional financial support. Similarly, others who were given comparable punishments also rely on various forms of financial help and aid, whether from organizations, friends, or other support networks.
From your organization?
From this organization, yes.
But where do you get the money?
From membership fees, which are collected from every individual involved in the organization. These modest contributions serve to directly support our efforts and those in need. For example, if I'm a member of this organization, I contribute €3 a month, totaling €36 a year. And from that, we
build a fund for your organization.
Build the organization's fund.
What is this?
In the first section here, we have a collection of documents detailing various court cases against former border guards from the GDR. These files include evidence and verdicts from their legal proceedings. Let's take one at random.
Okay.
This one right here, for example, labeled as case number 290, which seems to stand out for some reason. If we take a closer look at this document, it's actually a court ruling against a man who faced serious legal consequences. He was officially accused of distorting justice, with charges significant enough to warrant a formal trial for violating the law.
Yes.
The verdict was inevitable.
So he broke the law, is that it?
Yes, that's exactly what they said happened, word for word. So, the next one, this buyer guy and someone else, both stepped in to help him out when he needed it most. So, in this way, all of these cases were documented.
Are these just duplicates of court files?
Yes, they're reproductions of the original case files.
Why are you keeping these?
Why? To preserve them. I doubt everything is being properly maintained or kept intact in the archives these days.
For future generations?
Exactly.
I really admire this German trait of admitting their mistakes and taking full responsibility for them. It shows commendable maturity. Right now, they're digitizing the Stasi archives. Meanwhile, we still can't access the NKVD archives. They're sealed tight, completely inaccessible to the public even now. Here, though, any citizen can come, request their file, and see what the Stasi had on them. Many people do. They request their files to find out if any of their relatives were Stasi agents, maybe even reporting on them. And all of that is, of course, remarkable and quite impressive. But then, shocking discoveries come to light, like finding out your brother was informing on you, or even your husband. Honestly, I don't think I'd be ready to handle that kind of information at all.
I avoided to get to East Germany. I avoided to just ignore what happens. I avoided even the reunification. I mean, I wish every single person in the world personal freedom, that's for sure. But to share the country with my former, the people who, even the Stasi, I thought, people who made a career based on spying at other people, this is so pathetic. I deplore this. This is something I really deeply deplored. The surface was sort of moving. I couldn't even get it. And my brother was not alive at this time anymore, so that was the reason that I got the Stasi file. And, well, I need to accept this and to cope with this information.
Did your brother actually manage to harm anyone or cause any real damage? Did you read about that somewhere?
It's a very hard question, but I prefer to answer this. I got his Stasi file, and there is... Actually, he should inform about me. Next week, I will meet this American, the American filmmaker, and they applied for his perpetrator file. So next week or the week after, actually, maybe I find out.
What made you decide to work in a place that frustrates and angers you so much?
I work here because I don't want others to distort or romanticize history. I often hear people talking about how wonderful life was in the GDR, how we had the best economy in the world and cared so much about people. That's all nonsense, and it infuriates me deeply every single time I hear it. You have no idea how hard it was to gain victim status after the merger of the GDR and FRG just to get a small monetary compensation. But you understand they really destroyed you psychologically, leaving deep scars that you can never truly recover from. No matter the time, my sister still struggles with the weight of this trauma to this very day, and it continues to affect her life in countless ways.
For about a year, maybe two, it was a chaotic time in the East, kind of like your Russia in the 90s. No one knew what was going to happen next. Some thought the merger might not happen. Others said the GDR would continue, but with a different ideology and a new direction. But on October 3rd, 1990, the East German Chamber, which was temporarily governing the GDR, announced its decision. The Eastern and Western German states would unite. And that started a challenging and difficult time for many. People from the FRG, financial moguls from the West, came to our lands, bought up factories, and set up their businesses. Many East Germans were left without work or any real opportunities to rebuild their lives.
Am I right in thinking that GDR diplomas weren't officially recognized in the FRG system at all?
Not entirely. Certain social and medical professions were officially recognized. I personally had no trouble validating my education in the West.
Diplomas for physicists, biologists, chemists, mathematicians, and social educators were recognized without issue. I was able to validate my academic degree as well. But it was much harder for those in the humanities or people with economics degrees because of the political and ideological differences between the systems. Naturally, someone with that kind of education couldn't run a Western company.
So what professions did people most often switch to?
At first, selling used cars was very profitable. Cars were in short supply in the GDR, and suddenly everyone wanted to own a shiny Western car. And of course, people in the West quickly saw an opportunity to cash in and make easy money. But within just 2 years, all those dealers vanished from the market because there was so much fraud, dishonesty, and scamming in the business.
Compared to their Western colleagues, the pay gap was striking. It was about 25%. And even today, despite doing the same amount of work, Eastern Germans earn far less than Western Germans. I have an example. In the West, there's a woman, now retired, who worked in the same profession as I did. One day, she saw my pension slip, saw how much I was getting, and was absolutely shocked and confused by the disparity. And this is someone who worked far fewer hours than I did. In the West, the workday was shorter overall, but her pension, it's significantly bigger than mine.
How do politicians usually explain why they still can't equalize pensions, for example?
How? Do you think I can answer that? They're still arguing about it endlessly on various TV talk shows, and no one seems to have a clear solution. Honestly, I don't think it's even about a lack of money in the budget, because the government has money. It's about how they allocate it. Why does so much go to refugees? They have expensive phones, gold chains hanging around their necks, and designer jackets. And what do we have?
Of course, Eastern Germans are entirely justified in feeling the way they do. You live in your country, dreaming of some kind of free future, and when freedom comes, you find yourself a second-class citizen. Your degree isn't recognized. You're not hired for the jobs you're qualified for. And your pension is significantly smaller than that of Western Germans. That's truly terrible. It's as if you found yourself in a foreign country without ever leaving your own home. In your opinion, did the wall solve the problem, or did it simply delay the problem by an additional 20 years?
No, absolutely not. You can't frame the question like that. You really have to consider the broader context of the time. Back then, it was necessary and completely unavoidable.
But was the problem eventually solved?
Yes, to some extent. But with the overall weakening, economically speaking, of the socialist bloc, as we called it back then, instability grew. The bloc's economy faltered due to inefficiency, and political unity among its members began to break down. Naturally, things didn't just worsen, they worsened quickly, ending in collapse.
Yes, but wasn't the economic problem still there? Isn't that why the wall fell? Don't you think the issue was never really resolved?
So,
unfortunately, nothing was resolved.
So, looking at it from today's perspective, no, it really didn't solve much of anything.
It just ruined people's lives, didn't it?
Well, that's too
harsh?
Superficial.
This is a very good and interesting question, because an obvious sign of a problem. There is a societal problem, and this is there, but a wall can't be a solution.
They're
building it in America.
To build a wall in America. The idea of walls is not exactly brilliant, right? People who propose building walls just don't understand how small our planet is and how deeply interconnected everything has become. They think they can shut themselves off from someone or something entirely. It's just that these people lack the understanding that global processes are happening, whether we like it or not, and no wall is ever going to stop them. If there are migration processes on the planet, they need to be regulated, managed effectively, and adapted to, not blocked off or ignored. It's completely pointless. They don't realize that a problem you leave outside your door will only grow over time and eventually break down that door with far harsher, more severe consequences than expected, ultimately creating a crisis much bigger and far more destructive than the one they tried to avoid.
2,000 years ago, proudest boast was Civis Romanus Sum. Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is Ich bin ein Berliner. There are many people in the world who really don't understand what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. For it is, as your mayor has said, an offense not only against history, but an offense against humanity, separating families, dividing husbands and wives and brothers and sisters, and dividing a people who wish to be joined together. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the word Ich bin ein Berliner.